Do I need the microphone? It's not that.
I mean, it's always better for capturing, but
okay.
You always tap the microphone to get decent audio, get some video equipment.
So can you? Oh yeah. Okay.
So for future generations.
For future generations, indeed.
Hey everybody, this is Michael Roytam. He's the Chief Data Scientist at Security. Going to be talking about predicting exploitability. Let's give him a big hand.
Cool. So I want to talk about prediction, but more importantly, this talk is about how to use data to make decisions and how to use data in the correct ways to make decisions. Most of the things that I'm going to talk about are really simple ways to use data. Most of you will have this kind of data available at home, and so there are a lot of take-home exercises for the reader here as well. But I want to talk about the types of data-driven analysis that you could do using different streams of security data, give you some examples of each one, and then in the last part of the talk, we'll do some hands-on playing with machine learning, and specifically with an application of machine learning that I hope will make it make sense to everybody in the room. So, for a bit of background, I work at Kenna Security. We are a vulnerability and threat intelligence platform. So we use threat intelligence data, but a specific subset of it, applied to vulnerability data to measure risk and, more importantly, to drive decision-making for our customers. And the way that we do that is we use a curated set of data, namely successful exploitation, to measure the probability that a particular vulnerability is actually. Where do we get that data? So we have two repositories. The first is all of our customer data, which is about 5 years of about 7 million assets and approaching 1 billion vulnerabilities that are live and open across different types of infrastructure. So when people do vulnerability scans with 7, Nessus, what have you, I have that large pool of data to draw on. The second, which is a completely different data set, is a data set about vulnerabilities themselves and how they're used globally. Not necessarily across our customer base, but across security MSPs, threat intelligence providers, providers like Reversing Labs, ISC SANS Storm Center. We have a kind of a backdoor into the OSIM product for Alien Vault. And so we get two things there. The first is if an IDS signature is triggered and at the exact same time a vulnerability is open on a system, then we know that that exploit that was trying to target that machine probably worked. So to us, that's a successful exploitation event. And those events, while no compromise may occur, no data was exfiltrated, are what we use to train our models about whether a vulnerability is risky or not. The second type of exploitation data we get is from Reversing Labs, which is essentially a piece of malware was found on a system, and we know that that piece of malware must have gotten in using this particular attack vector, this particular vulnerability, and then we know approximately when that happened as well. So that's also a successful exploitation. Again, maybe that malware did nothing, probably not, but we know how it got in there, and we use that data to train risk about vulnerabilities. So that's what I'm going to be using. Stop me at any time if it's not clear from which data set different portions are coming, because that's important. And keep in mind that the two data sets are completely different. One is our customers, we know about those, we know about the machines. The other is data we're getting from across the internet. And so those two aren't necessarily related. This is less a science and more of an art. But in making some statements and some judgment calls based on that kind of data, you get some useful insight. So let's jump in. There are three types of approaches that are data-driven in this world. The first is a retrospective analysis to see what has happened, and we report on it. We try to look at trends in the past or try to analyze it or rationalize it. The second is real-time processing, real-time analysis that tells you right now this is happening, this is how it relates to your entire infrastructure. Well, infrastructure is already too specific and security-centered, but I mean the kind of, how many steps are on your iPhone reporting. And then the third, and the holy grail of many of our security friends, are predictions. I would argue that there is nothing in security today that is predictive at all. No tool predicts the future of a vulnerability, of an exploit, of the state of your system, or of the state of your security. The state of the art today, the best that we do is we have some real-time analysis, whether it's capturing firewall logs or trying to reverse malware or trying to prevent vulnerabilities or measure their risk. All of those tools are at best here and now real-time analysis and reporting. So we're going to take a particular problem, one that I'm very familiar with because it is my day job, and we're going to try to make some steps towards prediction in this problem. So by no means is this a product that we sell or we use. This is kind of a skunkworks project. And we're going to try to issue forecasts about vulnerabilities. That'll be the prediction. And I'll talk through how to set up that problem, how we try to solve it, where we are, and where we hope to go. Let's start with the beginning. The problem that we try to solve is that there are too many vulnerabilities, and we want to derive risk from vulnerability in a data-driven manner. There's tons of vulnerabilities out there. Not all of them are risky, and to measure risk is to figure out the source of the greatest risk, which is not that easy of a problem itself. And there are three ways to do it. So there's the retrospective manner. That one was done decades ago, well, about a decade ago, by vulnerability scanning vendors, by the National Vulnerability Database and MITRE when they published CVSS. What that did was it looked at all the types of vulnerabilities that had existed in the past, and it said we can classify them into a couple buckets, things with low access complexity, medium access complexity, low authentication, no authentication required, or some authentication required. They found these facets that describe the past data, and then they looked at all of the things that had occurred in the past, and they're still looking at it. They're still publishing CVSS subvectors, which is a whole bunch of data about vulnerabilities, as well as scores that they've created based on that historical framework. So this is all really useful information to have about vulnerabilities. This is how you learn from retrospective analysis. But this does very little to tell you about where the risk resides. What this tells you is information about how to measure vulnerabilities, not to how to measure whether they are risky, whether they're going to be used by attackers, and whether or not you should be remediating those or worried about them. So enter real-time analysis, which is where we take a look at how those vulnerabilities are actually being used in the wild. And this is why I talked about those two data sets in the first place. Here are a couple of mashups of those two data sets that we've done and published in a bunch of papers. This comes from a paper we published, and there's a couple in the Verizon DBAR that we submitted data to as well. So if you take a look at what attackers are exploiting, what those successful exploitations are, and you try to pair that to the live in the wild population that we happen to have a sample of because we're a vendor, you start to learn a few things. So what this graph shows you is, I'm going to make my presenter notes smaller so I can see it better. So what this graph shows you is essentially for every vulnerability that was to be exploited in 2015, how many days did it take for that exploitation to occur? And so when you aggregate that, what you get is a cumulative distribution function that tells you after 10 days, if a vulnerability was to be hit in the first year since its release, then what's the probability that it was hit after 10 days? And you go up from the bottom of the graph and you see that that probability is about 15%. Interestingly enough, add 365 days because of what we've chosen to report on, which is all vulnerabilities that have been hit within 365 days, you see that that number goes to 1. And at 0, it's not necessarily 0 because, there's some probability that there was a negative day attack or a 0-day attack, and we only know about the vulnerability after we've captured something about its exploitation. But more importantly, this graph gives you an estimation of how quick attackers are to exploit a vulnerability when they do go after it. And so, you could say that there's an inflection point here, which is why there's that gray line behind it. That gray line measures the change between the dots. It doesn't actually tell you anything about the information itself. But that inflection point is really useful because it tells you that that's probably where you should have your benchmark. That's the part at which looking more days, so if you were to set a benchmark of attackers are X days fast, if you looked further than that inflection point, you wouldn't be adding anything to that policy because there's a small variation, small change there. So if we were to set a policy, we would set it somewhere around the 40 to 60 day mark. That's where this inflection point occurs. I'm pointing not to the slide, but to my thing. So at that inflection point, it's probably about 40 to 60 days since a vulnerability is released. At that point, the probability that a vulnerability has been exploited is around 90%. So if you're going to get hit, you're going to get hit in the first 40 to 60 days. Now keep in mind, this is an overestimation of how fast attackers, or how slow attackers are. That is to say, within the first 40 days, there's a non-zero probability at every step. Within 10 days, there's a 30% chance you'll get exploited. Within 20 days, there's a 50% chance you'll get exploited. So that's the upper bound on how slow they are. Chances are, within that bucket, you're still getting hit. But if we take that upper bound and we compare it to how quickly we're remediating vulnerabilities, something becomes very apparent. We are slower at remediating vulnerabilities than attackers are at exploiting them. Common remediation rates that we see are somewhere between 120 and 150 days. Sometimes there's like a gold mine rush like with Heartbleed where people start remediating it within 15 days. But for the most part, it hovers around the 80 to 120 mark as an average monthly for all of our customers. And what that tells you is that that is also a lower bound. Essentially, that's only talking about the vulnerabilities that do in fact get remediated. And for everyone that does, there's hundreds that still remain open. So if you were to think about this as a process, as some kind of half-life evolution, then about 100 days is a good lower bound on how quickly vulnerabilities are being remediated. If that's the lower bound for defenders, and the upper bound on how fast attackers are is 40 to 60 days, then there's that gap between how quickly you remediate something and how quickly they exploit something. So why does that gap matter? It matters because if it is true that they are exploiting something faster than we are remediating it, then what we remediate matters a great deal. Because if we're not remediating the exact things they're exploiting, then they have open gates, they have ways to break in, and they do. Common logic tells you should remediate everything that comes out on Patch Tuesday, or everything you read in the news, or every critical vulnerability you heard about last week, but that's just not true. If you look at the vulnerabilities, so this is a different breakdown. This is not a breakdown of the live vulnerabilities. This is a breakdown of just the definitional level vulnerabilities, just the CVEs themselves. If you look at all of the vulnerabilities that were successfully used in an exploitation attempt in 2015, then only about 72 of them were published in 2015. The rest were published maybe years, maybe a decade beforehand. And so what that tells you is if you're chasing the Patch Tuesdays, you're exposing yourself to attacks across a wide variety of publication dates of vulnerabilities that might be 10 years old. You know, in 2006 or 2007, there were over 100 distinct vulnerabilities that were used in successful exploitation attempts. If your policy is Patch Tuesday, you missed those. And a lot of people did. They missed JBoss when it came out in 2016, and they got exploited on it often. And so, if recency is not a good standard, and this is a good aside to think about why recency isn't a good standard, it's because attackers need time to develop an exploit and weaponize it. And so sometimes they will find a really appealing vulnerability to write an exploit for, or they found an exploit already and we just learned about that vulnerability's publication. But sometimes, you know, they revisit something old. They take a look at the National Vulnerability Database just like we do and think, well, that 2005 vulnerability, I think I could write an exploit for that. And I should test it. And nobody's going to remediate it if I start exploiting people on that vulnerability. And that happens all the time. Those are the things that we miss, and those are the things we need to be focusing on. So, what's a better way to focus rather than Patch Tuesday? And that's by looking at a factor that actually correlates to attacker incentives. So this is also a strange, bastardized metric, but this is essentially looking at, if you were to look at our sample size, which is about 1 billion live open vulnerabilities across 7 million assets, and you were to randomly throw a dart at a particular definition and remediate that vulnerability, what's the probability that the portion of the population that you have remediated was a portion of the population that would have been exploited? So if you pick a random CVSS 10 vulnerability and throw a dart at it, that's, I want to say 28,000 vulnerabilities right now. If you pick one of those, then the chance that you're remediating a portion of the population, so scaled to the existence of those vulnerabilities, is about 11.5%. So 1 in 10 times you'll be remediating a vulnerability that actually poses risk to your organization or actually would have led to compromise. If you just look at a random vulnerability in the exploit database, which is about 22,000 vulnerabilities that have proof of concept exploit code, some of which works, some of which doesn't, then that probability quickly jumps up to 17.5%. And the reason it does that is because it is easier for an attacker to write an exploit and use that exploit successfully if a proof of concept code has been derived for it. If you look at Metasploit, then the probability jumps up to about 27.5%. And if you look at something that was first in exploit DB and then in Metasploit, so the intersection of the two, that probability quickly jumps up to 36%. So this is your real-time data-driven analysis of that problem, right? How do we derive risk from vulnerability? We look at what it is that attackers are doing. We try to measure their behavior. And in real time, we try to predict, or not predict, we try to describe which vulnerabilities pose risk to us. We do that by looking at the live exploitation traffic that I have, but you could also do it by looking at your Splunk instance and seeing which signatures are triggered on which vulnerabilities. You can look at it and then derive a heuristic like Metasploit and Exploit DB are the types of vulnerabilities that we need to care about. And so that's all good. That exercise is useful because it informs us about kind of what we should be describing with our data, meaning attackers themselves, rather than vulnerabilities. But That answers the question in one particular way. A subset of the question I asked earlier is, I have 10 million vulnerabilities today, which ones should I remediate? And that requires data-driven analysis and thinking, but the answer to that question is widely known by industry. It's you remediate old ones that are stable and have weaponized exploits, because that's the biggest chance of compromise, because just about anybody can compromise you on them. But the more interesting question, the one that's not yet answered, is if a vulnerability comes out today, and I think about 15 came out today, do we have to scramble or not? Like, do we care about that vulnerability? Does it pose a risk to our organization? And all we know about it is perhaps some of the CVSS vector, like authentication, complexity, whether it's a remote code execution or not, a CVSS score if we're lucky, and maybe some metadata about that vulnerability. So can we use something to make predictions about it? And the answer is yes. It's just kind of complicated. So now we enter the main portion of the talk. Everything I talked about previously is nice insight and it's useful information, but it's important to understand that all of that data that I used about vulnerabilities is data that's available and known about vulnerabilities way after they are released. So we use things like IDS signature scanners or malware sandboxes to reverse malware to find out whether or not that vulnerability is being used. We have to measure its volume and velocity. We have to think about whether or not that vulnerability actually exists in systems. All of that data only exists after the vulnerability has been released. But we need to think about just the period of time when the vulnerability has been released, that exact second. And so enter machine learning. Specifically, though, we need to figure out a way to use machine learning well and accurately, because throwing all of this data into a data lake and thinking about it, A, not very useful, B, there's not a lot of data to throw in if you're talking about trying to predict something for which you don't have data at the time. So the most important part of this talk is trying to figure out what it is that we want to predict, what it is that we want to do with machine learning. And my answer is this. When a vulnerability comes out, the biggest risk factor, as we saw in the real-time analysis, is whether or not it has an exploit written for it. And so let's do that. Let's just predict when a vulnerability is released, will it have an exploit written for it or not? That's a binary classification problem with very stable machine learning methods that work for it. And that's a problem that if we do solve, if we issue a forecast or a probability of how likely a vulnerability is to have an exploit, is something that we can use because we already know that having an exploit is indicative of risk by looking at that past data, by analyzing past exploitations. Specifically, we use Amazon machine learning to do so. Anybody can log in and throw some data in there and try to figure out how it works. And to get a little nerdy, we use a 70-30% evaluation split. We use all of the vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database for which we have complete data, which is 81,000 vulnerabilities. The specific type of support vector machine that's used in Amazon Web Services for this is a L2 regularizer, so it's a way in which it assigns coefficients to different variables, and you use that one when you are trying to predict two things that are very different. So a vulnerability that is exploited and a vulnerability that isn't, I assume, are very different, and hence why we use that one. Also because we used L1 and it's substantially worse. Each model uses 1 gigabyte of memory and it does 100 passes over the data. And then we measured the ROC, so essentially the area under the curve, to try to figure out whether that model is good or not. So let's dive in really quick, and then I'll explain what this all means. If you just import the base data about a vulnerability, the CVSS base, the CVSS temporal, remote code, whether it's a remote code execution or not, availability, integrity, confidentiality, authentication, access complexity, access vector, and the publication date. That's the base data that you can get about a vulnerability the second it's released. Then you get a really terrible model that means nothing. That model, 80% of them are correct, but the problem with this model is that there are a ton of true negatives. There are not that many true positives if you think about the whole data set being 81,000 vulnerabilities and us evaluating 30% of it. And 12% of the records are predicted as 1 with, only some of those being correct. More importantly, it's really hard to figure out at which point you gotta cut the model, at which point you should set your threshold, where it's a meaningful point. Because both exploited data and unexploited data, both exploited and unexploited vulnerabilities, are clustered together in this model. So there's not a lot of separation. What do I mean by that? A good machine learning model looks like this. Essentially, you want to minimize the shaded areas, because the shaded areas are where your model is incorrect at classifying vulnerabilities one way or the other. And then you want to maximize the yellow areas and the gray areas. The yellow ones are where you are correct about vulnerabilities you say that something is exploited and it is in fact exploited. And the gray ones are the opposite. You say it's not going to get an exploit and it never does. To put it more simply, that's a bad chart, that's a good chart. So graphically, as I add things to these models, as we try to get a good one, think about it this way. We want to introduce separation so that it's really obvious for us visually or for a machine to determine where the right decision point is, on which side of the equation do the exploits lie, and on which side of the equation do the non-exploited vulnerabilities lie. So as we try to go through this, there's also something really important to think about. If I wanted to solve this problem in a graduate class, I would try to get a really high percentage of correct classifications, and I would try to get that 79 up to 90. But the reality of security doesn't work that way. There are different values and there are different business risks to classifying something as true positive or false positive. And I would argue that in our scenario, really the only thing we care about is maximizing the number of true positives in the model. And I think that because, let's think about how this model is used. If this model was used to drive remediation and fire off tickets to Jira or ServiceNow and then have developers scramble, then we will want it to be the most accurate model in the world. But in reality, this is just an early warning system. All we want is this system to fire off alerts for as many of the actual exploits that will get exploits as possible, and then we'll feed that into a larger decision-making calculus about the priority of the application it's on, the priority of the servers that vulnerability might be on, other information that we know about it. And the times when we have false positives, those don't matter all that much because we have other data that will come out days later telling us whether or not we were right or not. So if we miss something, hopefully the other data we collect in our other decision-making processes, like whether or not it'll end up in Metasploit or not, will tell us about it at the time when we would have known otherwise. If we're classifying it as correctly something that is if we're incorrectly classifying it as something that's being exploited, not that big of a deal because it's still a vulnerability and you still probably need to remediate it. But it would be nice if the model was accurate. So what I'm trying to say is the correct answer to this problem, the most correct mathematical representation, isn't necessarily the one that is most useful in a security organization. To a security organization, the most useful thing is being correct about the most number of vulnerabilities at day 0 that are going to be exploited. Because for every one that you're not thinking is going to get exploited and you're letting that lag occur of 30 to 60 days until it ends up in Metasploit until you measure it, you might have already been exploited. Everything else, we have other methods and other systems already in place for dealing with. We have incident response, we have vulnerability management, we have other data coming in. So the cost of those other kind of bad things in the model that are assumed to be equally as bad is greatly reduced by our other systems. All right, so let's walk through 4 other models right now. And all of these models do is we add more information, and that information stretches out our curves, which is nice because you can graphically see it. But it also adds information about what attackers are doing or how they're behaving in relation to those vulnerabilities that allows us to make the decision and allows us to get some separation. The model we'll get at the end is not perfect, but it's substantially better at doing the one thing we needed to, which is getting more true positives in the system. So first, at day 0, you know whether a patch exists for that vulnerability or not. So I think attackers think about that too. I imagine that an attacker, when they see a new vulnerability in the National Vulnerability Database, stops and thinks, well, if the patch already exists and they're already patching it in the Patch Tuesday release, what am I going to spend effort 2 weeks writing an exploit for that just so that I can try to attack already patched systems? Whereas if the patch doesn't exist at the time of release of vulnerability, 2 things might be happening. The first is they might have already written the exploit and it's a 0-day vulnerability. And that's the way that we discover that the vulnerability exists. Or they might think there's an economic incentive for me to write this exploit because if I use it, I know that the systems that it affects are unpatched. So when we add that, the model stays just as accurate, but we get a little bit more true positives. And you can see it starting to stretch out, right? You can see that while there's still a humongous amount of overlap, there's a subset of our data that is very clearly on the exploitation side, the stuff that has no overlap at all. But it's really spiky and it's hard to cut off, and I don't really know how to do that. Still a pretty bad model. So we add more data. This is an interesting one, and I think perhaps the most important one that we could add. It's the only one that gives us this kind of very explicit separation, very explicit inflection point at which we should be cutting it off. If we add which vendors and which products it affects, we learn a whole bunch of information about the way that attackers think. First off, we all know that Adobe and Java exploits are more effective, and more of them get written. So that's already information we're incorporating at release time that helps us understand whether or not it'll get exploited or not. Second off, the products themselves matter a whole deal, because if it affects one Microsoft product versus it affects every single one of the Microsoft suite, there's a greater incentive to writing an exploit for that. There's also a greater chance that it's in a shared library, so it's easier to port that exploit to other things. And lastly, if there are multiple vendors that the vulnerability affects, you know it's a library vulnerability, or at least one that gets reused. And so the incentive for writing an exploit for that is much greater, and it's also more likely to be a remote code execution of some kind. When we add that, the model's accuracy spikes up, but also we go from 1,700 to 2,200 vulnerabilities classified correctly as being exploited without losing any sensitivity. Essentially, the same amount are true negatives. We have about the same amount of false positives. And our recall, so essentially our ability to correctly classify things that are actually being exploited, jumps up dramatically. But still, we're only talking about, 30% of 81,000. We're trying to classify 22,000 vulnerabilities, and we're only correctly classifying 2,200 of them as exploits. That doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem like the number of vulnerabilities that do have exploits written for them. So we're going to try some more things. This one is interesting. If I add the description of the vulnerability as it's written by NVD, after MITRE writes the description, NVD does some other descriptive writing. That description is essentially the analyst's write-up of what it is that the vulnerability is. And sometimes that's really boring and means nothing. But other times they'll say things like the mechanism of exploitation. Something like, this is a buffer overflow in a shared C library, or this is a remote code execution in RDP protocol. Things like that, things that describe the actual method by which one would exploit that vulnerability, are really descriptive of the actual effort it takes to write some exploit code. The ones that require you to like RAM scrape or like even Heartbleed, where you have to keep continuously looking at multiple things and then decipher them and have your own system for doing that, those are really complicated exploits to write. The incentive for writing them might be high, but you need to pair that off with how hard it is to write that. We use n-grams here, so we essentially look at either one-word, two-word, three-word, or four-word pairs to capture those kind of terms as factors. So one such term is remote code execution, highly indicative of an exploit being written for it. Another one is buffer overflow. Another one is in multiple libraries. There are all sorts of these things that analysts keep using and reusing. What's really interesting about this one is that CVE, or the National Vulnerability Database, is about to allow user submissions of the descriptions. And so Adobe, Microsoft, all of the kind of cans are going to be writing their own descriptions of the vulnerabilities. So we're either going to get much better data, or we're going to get inconsistent descriptions of the vulnerabilities, so this model might work worse. But it's something to monitor over time. Model gets better. We're now classifying 2,900 of the 22,000 exploits that we're trying to make a decision on as correctly having an exploit. And the overall number of correct jumps up to 84%. And so the last thing I'm going to add is something that is maybe cheating, maybe not. We're adding two things which describe how prevalent is that vulnerability and how much people currently care about that vulnerability, which I think is the core of what attackers think about when they think about weaponizing exploits. So vulnerability prevalence, I'm cheating because we have this large repository of vulnerability scans and we can just look across our customer base and say, which systems does this vulnerability affect at day zero? What percentage of the population does it affect? Great, this is a vulnerability that matters. Not everybody has access to this, but I would argue that if you just do it for your own infrastructure and take a look at the products you have installed on the number of machines and the proportion of the population that is affected, you get a pretty good representation, or at the very least you get one that's tailored to you. And then the second thing we look at, and this is probably the most interesting one, is a number of references in the National Vulnerability Database at the time of publication. So when the vulnerability comes out, sometimes you'll get something like Adobe Advisory, here's the CVE, here's one link to the Adobe Advisory. Other times, like if you take a look at Heartbleed or Shell Shock, or if you take a look at some things that do not have names that are important vulnerabilities, you'll see that everybody's scrambling to write about them. There might be a TechNet article about it. There might be a Rapid7 post about it. There might be a Qualys half-day of vulnerabilities post about it because it was the most critical thing that they found that week. The more of those references there are, it doesn't even matter where they come from. The more of them there are, the more predictive power you get, because that means that people think the vulnerability is easy to exploit. People think you should be scrambling, and there's consensus on that scrambling, and it comes from verified sources. So there's a couple of studies that have been done in the past at the University of Maryland about using social media to do this kind of prediction, and that's really susceptible to attacks by other people. There's now a CVE bot that NVD maintains that just tweets every single CVE. So if you're using something like mining Twitter for CVEs, that'll be hugely affected by that. But these are the verified ones. This is how you know that lots of people who actually care and write about these things are writing about these things. So when we add that data in, we finally get some serious results. 3,300 true positive vulnerabilities out of the 21,000 that we're trying to classify. Number of true negatives is about the same as it was when the model was only 79% accurate. And most importantly, 20% of the records are predicted as 1. 20% of the records are predicted as having exploits, which is actually pretty reflective of what you see if you just look at any subset of it. If you just look at what percentage of all vulnerabilities have exploits written for them, it's about 20%. This model is still not great, right? This model isn't something that I would bet my life on, but it is something that I would bet 10 or 20 bucks on, and it's certainly something that I would bet a day of developers' time on. If we can be correct about predicting whether or not a vulnerability will be exploited 85% of the time, and by the way, this is all using only public data available at the time that the vulnerability is released, you could certainly play around and get a little bit better at it by getting some proprietary data, getting some better descriptions of the vulnerabilities, getting some more data about the exploits themselves, then this model is a really good input to throw into an overall vulnerability management system. That is, if your current process today looks like it's Patch Tuesday, let's run, maybe a better process is it's Patch Tuesday. Of the 8 vulnerabilities released that have a patch, do we really need to apply it to these? Because if this model is pretty sure that an exploit is never going to get written for this thing, maybe we hold off on that one and address something where we already know a Metasploit exists. And so, to summarize in more simple terms, that's a bad chart, that's a good chart. We had a bad chart, we have a decent chart. Here's how the metrics changed. So interestingly enough, our false positive rate actually went up 2% here, but there's a reason for that. And, on paper, perhaps the first model is just as accurate and looks better, but that increase in false positive is tempered by the fact that our precision jumps by a lot, by something like 15%, and that precision is what is useful in a vulnerability management program. A couple of next steps here. There's clearly 2 things happening here. The first is that there are some vulnerabilities that are negative day vulnerabilities is what I call them, and then there are positive day vulnerabilities. The negative day vulnerabilities, this same model can't be making predictions about them because negative day vulnerabilities are things that are found precisely because they are being exploited. So the vulnerability is only related because it's exploitable in the wild. The second process is the one where we can make accurate predictions. The one where you just find a vulnerability and hope for the best that nobody writes an exploit for it. That we can make some good statements about whether attackers will or won't write exploit code for them. So it's important to be able to separate the two. And again, there are words in those descriptions that can indicate to us which ones we should and shouldn't care about. Something like found in the wild, discovered in the wild, as reported by Microsoft's whatever system. So if we can mine those out, that'd be cool. The second is that the world of exploits that we use for the training data and the outcome data is pretty small. We're only using Exploitdb and Metasploit. In reality, there are tons of other exploit kits that could give us richer data about which ones are and aren't being exploited. Your Angulars and neutrinos and all of those that maybe are even a completely different model, a different stage, but would tell us which ones of those vulnerabilities people are earning money on, which is also a huge bit of data that we could use to figure out which ones create incentives. So I already talked about finding better descriptions because that descriptive text is powerful. If there are people that do the kind of breakdown analysis of the exploitations of the vulnerabilities themselves that go much deeper than saying buffer overflow, then there are probably other indications of the level of complexity of writing an exploit in there. I don't know. I don't write exploits, but the metadata seems to say yes. And then it perhaps makes sense to break it down by vendor because the types, it's one thing to say an Adobe Reader vulnerability came out, that vulnerability is going to get hit. It's another thing to be able to say, of the Adobe Reader vulnerabilities, this one is the most likely or the one that's going to be fastest to exploit. All of them are going to get exploited at some point, though. The last part is that this is step one in the conditional probability of figuring out whether you're going to get hit on the vulnerability or not. So step one is figure out whether someone's going to write the exploit. Step two is figure out whether that exploit will be effective. So once this model is trained well enough, gets up to 95, 99% accuracy, then the next step is to take the outputs of this model and run it through an analogous model that says, once the exploit exists, is it going to be successfully used in an exploitation or a compromise? And that's the data that we used to do the real-time analysis in the past. And then if we can do that, then hopefully what we end up with is, with some degree of certainty, when a vulnerability comes out, we can tell you whether or not a compromise will occur based on that vulnerability in the future. And even if that degree of certainty is 80%, then we're talking about, deciding whether to pack your umbrella to work or not versus just hoping for the best. I got to put my money where my mouth is. I first gave this talk at RSA, and when I ran that model, you can check when these vulnerabilities came out, and you can check that they all came out around the same time. I ran them through the model, and I was like, let's pick 3 that I'm pretty sure about. Since then, 2 of them have had successful exploitations on them. 1 has not, but I'm still holding out hope because I didn't specify a time frame. So take a look at the timeline of these vulnerabilities. It's super interesting to see, obviously that reader vulnerability was going to get hit. We all knew that without me running it through the model. But it's interesting to see how quickly it was and why it was. If you read the description, you can see just how easy it would be to write an exploit for it and how many, it affects like every version of Reader ever. So of course somebody was going to write something about it. And then the other one that got hit is that Windows Server 2008 vulnerability. It was a shared font. Like some font was really corrupt and allowed for something to affect like everything that Microsoft has ever produced. So like, it's very clear to me that if I wanted to steal some money from some, inject some ransomware somewhere, it would be awesome to create a malicious font and then start spraying it across the internet. And that is exactly what people did a couple months later. Hopefully that SharePort one gets exploited, or I can just replace the predictions and hope I'm right the next time. This is also indicative though, right? Like I'm kind of glad that one of them didn't, because this is describing exactly where this is useful and where this isn't. As those vulnerabilities came out, like yes, I was going to be wrong 1 out of 3 times or 1 out of 5 times or whatever, but it's still useful information and more specific information than the typical thing that we do when a vulnerability just comes out, which is either A, wait for the data about its criticality, or B, make a decision based on another heuristic that we've derived. And that's it. Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns, mostly about this?
So when you add the references in, just to course correct, you're taking this from day 0 as predicting exploitability at day 0?
Right.
So when you look at the MVD, this obviously the data that you're looking at is to do this is after the fact. It's not day 0 MVD data, right?
Right.
So how do you take the references that may have been there 4 years ago and know at day 0 what references were there?
They have an update changelog, right?
But do you parse that? Like that's my I guess the question is they have a change.
They have a changelog. We don't currently parse that in this model. So there's definitely bias in the way of using references this way, because it's the ones that end up being exploited and people start writing about, like the Wall Street Journal, will have more references. But it's also true that Heartbleed had more references when it came out, right? The reality is people don't care about vulns that aren't media published. So those numbers are pretty okay. CV details is a really good place to get day 0 state information, because you can walk back through the state there. They actually like highlight the revisions as they happen.
Yeah, like vulns I've submitted, like they're to CVE, you could submit links after the fact,
right,
a month later, and it'll populate.
The reality is that very few get updated. Like if you look at it, something like 2% of CVEs have ever been updated after the fact. And it's either because somebody wrote an exploit for it and started exploiting it, or it's because they don't really accept random blog post links kind of thing. Because they have new ones to think about. It's like 3 people, right? So the other ones that get updated a lot is when they were wrong about the CVSS score. And so if somebody wrote a post or something being like, hey, this thing actually matters, you guys miscategorized this, then they'll do an update. It's a pretty small portion of vulnerabilities. But I suppose you are correct. There's bias because I'm guessing all of the ones that get updated do have exploits. Oh, that's a good measure too, right? Whether or not there was an update.
Got another question.
Yeah.
Early chart, the graph that was going up to the right, and you're doing the 40, 60-day window, and then past 100 and all that.
Yes.
With that, so my question is based on how you guys are, as I understand, so you have your open vulnerabilities, you've got signatures that are getting hit in those environments. What is the test of, or the cutoff for people that have deployments of IDSs or vulnerability scanners that are not updating? So if you're seeing 40 to 60 days, are they just not updating for 2 weeks, and that's why, are their data sets waiting to find this trend?
So this was retrospective, right? The way that I looked at it was at the end of 2015, I had collected a bunch of data from the correlation of IDS and vulnerabilities. By the way, not our customers, but just like global threat stuff. That told me here are all the vulnerabilities that were ever successfully exploited. And then to build that CDF function, I looked at the existence of vulnerabilities in our system. So you are absolutely correct. There is that delay, right? Between vulnerability created, IDS signature written, IDS signature installed, somebody installs it on their actual box, and then we get a trigger alert. Which means that, at best, for most vulnerabilities, we only know about the successful exploitation like 2 weeks after. So you are correct, but the bias is the other way. Essentially, yes, you're right that people don't update signatures, which is why they get hit. But the way that I performed this analysis isn't to say this person got hit at this time, let's build the CDF. It was I looked at these things got hit in 2015, let's look at what was open in 2015. And so me knowing what got hit in 2015 is the thing that's delayed, meaning that in reality, it's probably like 20 to 30 days. If you look at, if you remove the bias of signature installation. Yeah, it's a bad way to collect exploitation data, but
it's all super rich. I was just more thinking about this as you were talking. Like, based on customers I've had in the past, when an event happens versus when they know about it happening.
So I'm very certain that this CDF is wrong, but I'm also very certain that it's probably the upper bound. So like it could only go faster. I can't think of an argument as to why attackers would be slower. Yeah. We haven't run this with the reversing labs data yet, so we have access to their sandbox, and we can see when they reverse malware. I don't know anything about malware reversal, so there's probably some kind of similar bias, but it might be that introducing that kind of data would remove some of those and speed this curve up. I mean, I don't know, a lot of it is automatic nowadays, but some of it isn't. I don't know. Cool. Well, slides will be on the internet. Will be tweeted from the Twitter, and ask any questions on the Twitter. Thank you.